And as you say, a very warm welcome to everybody, our virtual summit. And this particular session, Last Time Movers and Shakers, Market Shaping Older People's Housing. I'm absolutely amazed that we've got over 3,000 registrations of people who are joining us during the week, and that comes down to about 800 plus individual attendees. All the sessions have been really well received, and we've been really delighted to kick off this session with Shakespeare, Martineau and Louise Drew and the team, who we've worked for a number of years on a wide range of influential papers influencing government policy, local practice around the spotlight on the retirement housing sector. I'd like to also thank all our sponsors. If I could have the next slide, please. Both our headline sponsors, Guinness Partnership, Tunstall, UKRI, Healthy Aging Challenge and Love a Later Living, and also our associate sponsors, Extra Care, Faithful Gould, Housing 21, Invisible Creations, Johnny Johnson, ProCare, PRP, and of course, today's sponsor, Shakespeare, Martineau. We've had a fabulous turnout, as I've said, and I hope you won't be disappointed by this impressive cast we've got for you for this opening session. And I'm going to hand over to Louise Drew, who's going to say a few words and introduce the speakers. So Louise, thanks ever so much for your support. It's great to be working with you, and the platform's yours.
Many thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Sally, for starting us off. Good morning, everybody. I don't know about you, but the sun is just about shining, albeit it is terribly cold today. So I'd like to welcome all of the panelists here. We have, in a specific running order, Professor Peter Roberts, OBE, who is the former chair, as you can see on the slide, of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and a professor at Leeds University. There is nothing that this man does not know about retirement housing and town planning. Ruth Jennings, the Executive Director of Care and at East Midlands Housing Group. Emma Webster, the Head of Corporate Affairs and Political Engagement at the Life Story Group. And heading up at the end, Tony Watts, OBE, who is a writer and co-founder of the Age Action Alliance. I'm going to start us off with a very brief overview of the findings of the white paper that we are having a soft launch today, that Shakespeare Martineau, with a number of contributors from the registered provider market, have helped us pull together. And once I've started off with those key themes, you'll see how those themes pervade through the sessions that the panelists are going to do about how we can deliver far more retirement living in the sector. What I'd also like to examine, if at all possible, is we all attend these sorts of conferences and it's often much of the same and we haven't moved forward much. And I would like to kind of explore today whether or not we are seeing a movement that is increasing the amount and the activity in that sector that will help to kind of solve the current housing crisis that we have. So if anybody has anything that they want to put in the Q&A box around positive messages where people have seen things change over the last 5 to 10 years, I'd really like to explore that as well. So Jerome, if you could take me on to my first slide, please. So moving on, this is our new paper where we wanted to try and explore whether or not later living could be the answer to the housing crisis by concentrating on last-time buyers and not first-time buyers, as has been the case for so very long. Next slide, please. And we started with a hypothesis. I wanted to explore whether people over the age of 65 are more likely to be living in a home that is too large for their needs. So what we did was we reached out to a wide sector within the registered provider market of people working for those RPs and working most specifically in retirement living, seeking to get tenant data on their residents around their age demographic. Next slide, please. So in numbers, we basically had 200,000 general needs rental properties that we explored the data around, looking at the age demographic of who was living in these properties and who the lead tenant was and the age of that lead tenant. This covered 200 local authorities, so it also included Scotland. We then interviewed 20 residents that were actually living in either extra care charitable trust or retirement villages properties, with a view to asking them specifically why they had decided to move. And then finally, we did a separate consumer survey where we surveyed 1,000 consumers who were aged over the age of 50 in order to see what their views were on potentially right-sizing at some stage in the future. Next slide, please. Now, this graph shows you that effectively 87% of people aged over the age of 45 are living in unoccupied homes. So that is a huge figure, but the really big figure is that 40% of those 200,000 units are occupied by people over the age of 65. Next slide, please. I should just say that under occupied, we basically took the view that if somebody was living in a property, either on their own or with their partner, and they had 3 bedrooms, that was classified as under occupied. So then 6 in 10 people over the age of 50 had no plan or did not know whether or not they would ever downsize one day. So it obviously showed us that 6 out of 10 people have not really given this any thought at all. So then that leads to thoughts as to why is this? Why is it not being discussed within families? Why are people not talking about the opportunity to right size into accommodation that will actually give them huge benefits in their later years? Next slide, please. Now, basically, between men and women, it is a slightly different age criteria, but it's roughly 63 to 64, age 63 to 64 is the approximate time of healthy life expectancy. However, from the consumer survey, the average age that someone would actually consider right sizing isn't until 71. So we have a period whereby people are starting to find health conditions impacting on their life, but they're actually not even going to consider moving until they get over the age of 70. Next slide, please. Then, as part of the consumer survey, we asked people over the age of 50 what was important to them in terms of the accommodation that they would be interested in moving to. So what would their aspirational needs be? 60% said that it was to do with the location, so good walking distance to good facilities. 59% that said that green open space or a garden was important to them. 58% was self-contained accommodation, so independent living. And then 51% said that security and safety was really important to them. Next slide, please. Then we wanted, as part of the survey, to explore this whole idea around the property being an asset and the asset increasing in value, because in this country, we are fixated by our homes gaining value. And I wanted to try and see whether or not the whole idea of inheritance, giving back to the children, was that important. And the interesting thing about this statistic is the more money people had, the more the asset increasing in price meant to them. So the lower the income they had, the less they had an expectation that their property that they were living in would increase in value. Next slide, please. So then we also wanted to explore what's putting people off. So why are people not right-sizing? So the incredible statistic I think that comes out of this is that 28% of people said they didn't want to live in a community of older people. And what are we building when we're building retirement schemes, but schemes where lots of older people come together? Now, I caveat this because I am somebody who very much never says that one size fits all, and a retirement scheme may be right for one individual or couple, but it might not be right for somebody else. And so it's really important that we actually consider all types of accommodation for people aging. The next statistic was that 26% didn't think that it was an affordable option. So what's going wrong? You know, registered providers are building affordable schemes, but people actually don't realise that there is affordable accommodation out there that they can move into to age in place. 25% believed that they would lose their independence. Now, that is a shocking statistic. And I can only imagine that the reason for that is something that we discuss a lot, is because people do not understand what retirement living actually is. And they think that it is an old person's home, they think it's nursing or some form of residential home. And as a result, they lose independence because they're in a room on their own being looked after by others. And then finally, 19% thought that they'd be more isolated from family and friends if they went into a retirement scheme. Next slide, please. So what we're going to explore today with my panelists are these key themes that came out of it. So we need some planning changes. We've been crying out loud for that for a very long time. The exploration of having a later living use class specifically to deal with older people's accommodation. We need proactive investment. We need to focus the shift from first-time buyers into last-time buyers, and we need to champion the benefits of this sort of accommodation. So, without further ado, we're going to move on to our first panellist, which is Professor Peter Roberts, who's going to take you through his slides and comment further.
Thank you, Lou. Jerome, if you can put my slides up, I'm very grateful, please.
Just bear with me 10 seconds. It will be up. Yeah, it's up now, Peter.
Thank you. Well, the first thing I think, Lou, is to say thank you for the generous introduction. I actually don't know everything about everything. I wish I did. There are huge gaps in my knowledge. And I was taught by my Welsh grandmother, my 9, who was an Edwardian nanny, not a Victorian nanny. She used to ask me what the biggest room in the world was. It's not the Albert Hall, it's the room for improvement. So every day we need to learn, and thanks to Jeremy and the team for setting up this learning opportunity. My title was a bit exotic, Cutting the Gordian Knot. You'll recall that cutting the Gordian Knot was to solve an insoluble problem, and Alexander the Great cut the Gordian knot and solved an insoluble problem. So hopefully today, Lou and Jeremy, we can do for elder and vulnerable people's housing what Alexander the Great did in terms of resolving the difficulty of untying this really difficult knot. Next slide, please, Jeremy. Right, introduction. Why is it important? Well, it's important because at the moment we face a coincidence of crises in housing, health and social care. I'm very much reminded when I think about crisis of something which an old friend of mine, fortunately no longer with us, Walter Sturr, who was the director of the Vienna University of Economics, once said in one of his conference papers, and that was that crisis can be a productive state as long as you don't associate it with catastrophe. Now, for many older and vulnerable people in the United Kingdom, unfortunately, what we've done is not deal with the opportunities presented by the crises in health, housing and social care. And what we've done is to continue to put sticking plasters on an increasingly gaping wound. And that does not work. What we face is the fragmentation of and partial and inconsistent ways in which we deal with matters. And that means that we are wasting vast amounts of money, wasting vast amounts of public money, as well as leaving people in a precarious state. And we're doing this consciously in government. We're seeing that happen consciously in government. And I think it needs to stop, because even though my principal motive for being involved in this subject relates to people's welfare, I'm also conscious that we need to be very realistic about how we make the best use of available public and private money. So what is causing these problems? It's first of all reflecting massive divisions of responsibility in central and local government. Now, there have been some experiments, and I'll refer to them later, in central government to bring together functions and to link these functions to local government and to private organisations, in this case, housing associations. But generally, we have continuing big silos in central government between, for example, the Department of Health and Social Care and DLUP, which has responsibility for housing. Unsurprisingly, ministers, and I've worked a lot with ministers in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, ministers and permanent secretaries like their empires, and tried to persuade them to co-fund or to collaborate in funding activities is extremely difficult. The second issue that we've got is a reliance on private sector providers, and this is accompanied by poor funding. If you want to see good evidence of this, go and have a look at the recent survey done by the local authority directors of adult social care, which shows that they are really struggling, even at the discounted rate charged to local authorities, to provide care in care homes run by the private sector. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute, although there are examples of the private sector, if you like, profit taking, but many private sector providers struggle. They struggle with staffing, they struggle with funding, they struggle with a whole range of other services, including backup from health and social care itself. And there's a lack of a whole system, long-term approach, which partly Lou's already referred to in terms of the way in which the planning system's operated. I recently have been having a bit of a struggle with my friendly neighbourhood local authority, because I thought it would be a reasonably good contribution for somebody like me to help to write a neighbourhood plan. One of the areas that we put into the neighbourhood plan is allocated for vulnerable and older persons housing. The local authority don't like it. They say it can't be designated for a specific housing type. We've actually got a brilliant location for a small-scale extra care facility, and we can't actually progress it through the local plan as a specific small-scale extra care facility. That is crackers. It really is. I'm sorry, I don't have a technical expression for it. That is a suboptimal solution, I suppose I should say, as far as I'm concerned in terms of planning. And what are the consequences? And those consequences impact individuals as well as institutions. And when they impact individuals, it can lead to a lot of poor welfare, human suffering, and most appropriately, really, really poor health consequences. So if you don't not just right size the house, but you don't right type the house as well, then you can end up with people living in housing which does not meet their needs. And at an extreme, and it is the extreme, but it's a very large extreme, you end up with patients in hospitals occupying non-acute medical beds, or what used to be called geriatric beds, who can't be discharged because there is nowhere for them to go. And that is a very, very high cost option. My own research in certain given local authority areas where I know the cost per bed in a non-acute medical bed in the adjacent district hospital, my own research tells me that the cost per day of having that sort of person sitting in a hospital would pay 2 weeks' rent in an extra care facility. So half a day the weekly rent with the service charges for health and social care in an extra care in my sample authorities equals half a day in a hospital bed. That is an atrocious use of resources, public and private. You also have really poor housing stock usage, with people, as Louise and her colleagues have demonstrated, living in houses which are far too big, are beyond the individual private or rental tenant to occupy, who occupies to maintain, and that leads to suboptimal consequences for those tenants. And you end up with, as I say, delayed transfer of care. Next slide, please, Jerome. So this is a real waste. It's a real waste of money to the public purse. It's a real waste of individuals' money. And it's a real waste of other resources as well, especially very scarce staff to provide health and social care. There are opportunities to improve the quality of life for vulnerable and elderly people. It's a waste of an opportunity to deal with social and scarce social and healthcare staff in a more meaningful, managed way. And it's especially a real waste of housing stock. Now, I'm one of the people who's advocated what is called active stock management, where you, like Birmingham City Council have, where you actively try to get people in a house which is not just right size, but right type for individuals at different points in their life. But active stock management is not something that most local authorities engage in. We go and talk to planners, they don't even know what active stock management is. You go and talk to the housing section in local authorities and they muddle through. They don't actively or proactively manage stock. This waste has increased in the past decade with an absence of integrated working and poor strategic policy. And that has failed to deal with the causes, it's dealt with the consequences. That's my reference to the sticking plaster. And these failings are exacerbated by the impact of poor and unsuitable housing, and that the impact that has on the health and welfare of older and vulnerable people. The Rochdale case has put this into stark contrast. That happened to impact on a young child, but it equally impacts on the health of elderly and vulnerable people. And if you want to go and look at the literature on that, it is voluminous. A root cause analysis, if you do a root cause analysis, then what you find from existing research, such as the work done by HAPPY, the all-party parliamentary group, which Jeremy's involved with, and Lord Best, and if you look at the Thinking Ahead study done by the Republic of Ireland government, and if you look at Fiona Boyle's work in Northern Ireland, we find very, very similar causes and consequences coming up. Next slide, please. And this is what a waste, especially when we have solutions. It's not as though we don't know what we need to do. And it's not as though we don't have really good experience in terms of getting that right size, right type housing delivered in communities. So these problems that we're talking about are not unknown, and they're not without tested solutions. A glance at the LIN material that is voluminous or other practice reviews shows that solutions abound. And these solutions include extra care provision, sheltered and supported housing, retirement communities, the use of active stock management to move people around in especially social rented stock, but you could also induce owner-occupiers to move to more appropriate stock. This is linked to adaptations, if required, to make sure that people are able to live in a house which they continue to want to live in. And there are many others, as outlined in the Shakespeare, Martineau, and other reports. And these solutions are cost effective, and they do represent, most importantly for me, a much better quality of life and a much healthier life for the individual. Jerome, can we go to the final slide, please? So how do we cut the knot? This requires much better thinking, much better strategic thinking, and it requires overall properly programmed strategic action by central government. It will involve busting some of those silos that I referred to and the adoption of a total costing approach. Now, I could bore for hours, Lou, on the benefits of cost-benefit analysis, but it does provide, you have to trust me on this, without going into a 3-hour explanation. It does provide some real answers which demonstrate that these solutions are really, really cost effective. It also means that we have to be bold enough to innovate. And we don't need to be very bold because much of this work has already been pioneered by people who we probably know, colleagues we probably know in the adjacent housing association or the adjacent ICB area or the adjacent local authority. So we probably know examples on our doorstep of some of these solutions. What about co-funding or cross-funding of housing association provision by health funders? If we go back pre the formation of ICBs, we had some really good examples of clinical commissioning groups funding extra care facilities. The ICBs, with their larger budget and their supposedly sub-regional perspectives, really ought to be taking this forward. But I don't see the appointment of people on the boards of ICBs with the necessary skills. And I don't see the ICBs pioneering this at scale in their respective areas, tailor-made to meet the needs of their patients, their citizens, the people who through a lifetime have paid the taxes that then go into the ICB. So there's a question here of people saying, it's not something I'm begging for, it's something I've already paid for. Please provide me with appropriate health and social care by having right size, right type housing at this stage in my life. We can learn from wider projects, and the best I've come across is the one in South Wales, where the Welsh Assembly government, working with local authorities, working with the Aneurin and Bevan Health Board, working with housing associations, have produced a quasi-integrated system which deals with health, housing, health and social care in a place. And we can look at integrated working as encouraged by the Northern Ireland Supporting People programme run by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which works hand in glove with health and social care in Northern Ireland to deliver quality care for people in not only their homes, but also in places which meet their needs at a given point in life. And the outcome from this would be reduced delayed transfers of care, better patient flow in hospitals, more appropriate housing and care for elderly and vulnerable people, better use of scarce professionals, because, for example, a typical peripatetic care worker spends 50% of mainly her time, but could be his time, traveling. If you're delivering social care in an extra care facility, you spend 85% of your time or more delivering care and very little time traveling. And the same goes for health professionals. And a better enhanced quality of life. And at the last item, greater cost effectiveness and a much better use of money for both the state and for the individual. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you, Peter. Much to be discussed, I think, later on what Peter has just said. We've got some great Q&A questions going in, quite a lot showing how passionate people feel about this subject matter, especially around the aspect of age and what your home should look like. So we'll explore those a bit later. Going to go on to Ruth. Ruth, working for EMH, is going to explore with us today the what it's like to be a registered provider in this sector.
Unmute yourself, that's always best, isn't it? Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm Ruth, as it says on my slide. I've worked in the sector for about 35 years now, and 25 years of that has been in the care and support side of the RP, delivering a range of services, but extensively within the later living and retirement and extra care market, and that's for social rent and for homeowners. So I've got a real passion for people living later life well and with purpose and fulfilment. And I've worked with Lou over many years at Shakespeare, Martineau and Jeremy at the LIN. And I think we all share a great passion for all things later living. And we really welcome the white paper, Lou. It's a brilliant piece of work. Thank you very much. For those of you that here that are just as experienced, if not more than me, hopefully you can really relate to what I'm saying. It'll be good to hear from you in the discussion later, where you can add or enhance any perspectives that I've put across, or indeed add different ones if you feel you have them. So as Lou said, I've been asked, next one please, thank you very much. I've been asked to give a view from an operator's perspective of the benefits and the challenges in providing later living solutions. So at EMH, we've got quite a wealth of older stock, traditional sheltered housing stock, but we've also got 4 purpose-built operating extra care schemes, of which we're also a care provider, and we've got a further 2 in planning stage at the moment. So the operating environment is really tough just now. Building prices are rising, contractors are going bust, planning is taking a length of time that we've never experienced before, but especially the changes for the providers also delivering care. The recruitment market's bottomed out and it's really failing us. Predominantly that's due to the levels of pay we can affordably offer against other level entry type posts that are out there in the market. However, we know that what we offer really does improve people's enjoyment in their later life, but crucially in their health and well-being. And I think hopefully I speak for all the providers on the call that we're determined to overcome the challenges that are out there at the moment and work proactively with both government and our local authorities to address the housing and health inequalities for our ageing population. So in extra care, I've seen customers move into later living from long stay hospital, from residential care settings, but also long stay nursing care settings. And not only can their health stabilise and their independence stabilise, but they actively thrive and improve. But I think the key to someone thriving in later living setting is down to the timing. From experience, the majority of people moving into the rented units where there is possibly a care contract in place with a local authority, which is attached to a nomination route, is nearly always a move in care and or housing crisis. This is equally down to the person and their family waiting until the choice is no longer a real choice and not really having enough time to assess what's out there and what would be the most suitable for them or their relative. But also due to social care and health funding and how that's run, how its thresholds sit, which are not necessarily structured to pay for a prevention in care. So this cohort of customer normally has already got multiple health conditions and is probably highly reliant already on health and social care. And they often have had multiple acute hospital admissions and interventions already. And they are nearly always over the age of 75, but quite often over 85 also. So from my experience, it's predominantly the homeowner market that move at a fairly healthier stage of their ageing journey. And their move is more about lifestyle choice, the property working for them, making sure that their equity is still within something that works for them. And mostly they move at a much younger age. And this is the customer group from an operator's perspective, where I feel we see the true prevention in ill health in their ageing journey. They're often the cohort of people that live later life really well and ultimately die at home with us, with little or no need for acute inpatient care or long-term nursing care placements. This obviously is not true for all people that age in place within this cohort of people, but it certainly is the majority from my experience. And even people diagnosed with dementia live longer at home with us, and crucially, if they've lived in the extra care or later living setting prior to that health condition being apparent. Louise also asked me to talk about, from a registered provider point of view, what the challenges really to assist in a later living housing option can be. Age difference is more prominent now. I've been, as you heard earlier, I've been in this game for quite a lot of years now. And when I first started out, the age range was sort of between 75 and 85, and we were dealing with one generation. We now see big age differences both in couples. We can have people that are 20 years apart. There might be somebody in their mid to late 70s and their partner is in their late 50s, early 60s. So there's different generations within families looking at later living options. But also now we've got multiple generations. We've got customers in their 50s where, for the type of accommodation we're building and the disabilities that they have, extra care often meets that disability better for them than anywhere else in the community. So people from 50, and it's quite common now, we have people in the 90s and their hundreds, much more common than before. So probably 4 generations of people living in one setting. Also, when people have perhaps lost their partner, the confidence to move, the hassle and the sheer, problems of moving. How am I going to get the carpets? Who's going to move me? Especially with families living all over the country and the world now. So that can be a big blocker, especially if people have lived in the home for quite a long time. It's quite a wrench for people. And it's not really an aspiration yet in our country to live in retirement living. We see it as a trigger for us starting to age, perhaps in decline in our life. Also, accommodation type, Lou's talked about that quite a bit, and not always less people means less space, maybe less bedrooms, but sometimes the blockers around people's rooms and how they entertain. More people are having grandchildren over for longer in their lives. We see more people in their 70s working and needing a space to have office space within their home. And also, the range of people's needs within later living. We've got more people, older people coming out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, different faiths, different cultural needs, etc., all within one setting. And another issue for us is building, really, new construction methods, really, the green agenda. Planning's taken an age, as I said, but we're just working through our 2 schemes now, and parking and electric hookups is a big one. And they're expecting us to provide electric hookups for the whole community, not just for people living or visiting the service. Ground source heat pumps, our ability for our maintenance colleagues to adapt in their knowledge of all the new kit that's out there, really. And we've got buildings that are 7 or 10 years old that are already starting to be behind the curve, really, and what the capital cost and the long-term maintenance and retrofitting of those buildings are. I mentioned earlier that we're also the care provider, and there's been many care model changes over the years, and the commissioning of services has brought further challenges really to providers and also our funders who battle with reduced resources and ever-growing need. The viability and reputation risk is a concern for many RPs, for those who both deliver the care themselves or have traditionally in the past worked with a care partner. The commissioning cycles now mean that the registered provider are often no longer in control of who they partner with. They're no longer in control of the values of that company and their working relationships, and those partnerships are not as strong as perhaps we've seen in the past. And a lot of that is around austerity and the ability to make the pound go further. Also, the commissioning cycles can often be every 3 years, maybe 3 plus 1 plus 2. So the commissioning cycles have an impact on customers that worry about it, but also on staff, the constant 2p in and 2p out, etc. And also in the sector, there's often a question of whether that's a real choice anyway for a customer if the service is tendered out and there's one provider over multiple sites in a locality. There's an argument of whether this reduces choice or enhances choice. But through austerity, the funding that social care have to play with has definitely diminished, and this has had a direct result sometimes to the loss of services in smaller, more predominantly rented later living, where people living there probably can't afford to pay for the preventative services that extra care could deliver themselves. And the nature of those services now really doesn't meet the threshold for any local authority funding. I feel where efficiencies really could be made in care is around technology and AI. And the solutions here are for individuals with their actual care needs. And if this was built into care planning and needs assessments by the local authority and specifically OTs, etc., like they do with assessments for hoist, walking aids, that kind of thing, it could really benefit us, because certainly technology is part of our answer, but there's a real issue here that there's no real national strategy or timescale to provide an answer for the care crisis that we're currently in. So I'll just leave you with my final thoughts really on what we can do, because that can sound a bit of doom and gloom, but we're absolutely passionate that we find a way through this. Nationally, we don't have an agreed and collective response to ageing, and specifically housing in an ageing society. I think as RPs, perhaps we think we have a joint language ourselves, but there are so many providers in this market now that certainly we do have that national steer and that national understanding of what that is. We know that housing meets people's physical needs. If you get the housing right and it meets people's physical needs, this can drastically reduce the need for personal care. Yet it's often really the individual providers just offering a solution to the local authority who have expressed the need for extra care housing in their locality. But this is often the only solution on the table, and we know that this is not the only solution to our ageing society. So there's a need both locally and nationally in planning and in conjunction with a national ageing strategy to ensure we give a range of options that are fit for purpose, that the public actually want and they know about what they are, but also that they aspire to live in different accommodation as they age, which ultimately reduces personal care needs and the strain on the public purse. That's it from me, Lou. Thank you all for listening.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute. Thank you, Ruth. We've got some cracking questions coming in. there's a lot centered, there's a lot that's centered around personal circumstances, and parents who are of a particular age wouldn't even contemplate moving. And I would really like to explore that issue of, you know, at what stage do people get to a point where they have hit crisis? So they've left it and left it and left it because they're keeping the family home for the family, or continuing to work into, you know, later years, as we know people are changing in terms of retirement age and this, that and the other, and a real desire to keep independence. But at some point people cross that line of then being in a crisis point. So for me, it's around, how do we plan? How do we properly start to have those conversations with our older generation parents that make them aware of what alternatives might actually be out there, at a point whereby they make the step at the right time to extend their life and extend their health. So moving on, we're going to go to Emma Webster now. So we're going to hear from a private provider of retirement living. Emma, recently recovering from COVID. Thank you for joining us, because I know last week you were feeling properly poorly.
Thank you very much, Lou, and thank you so much to the HousingLIN for hosting this Festival Ideas. I think, as Peter reflected at the beginning, I've already learnt a huge amount from listening to other speakers, and also some of the feedback that's been put forward in the chat box. So thank you very much. And Lou, thank you once again for the excellent report from Shakespeare, Martineau, and for the early sight you gave me of the report, so that I was able to talk with a degree of knowledge and understanding this morning. So, as you said, my name's Emma Webster. I'm Head of Corporate Affairs at Life Story Group. And in the time that I've got today, I'm going to be focusing on a brief introduction, a bit of a reflection on the state of the market, and also taking some of the key learnings through from your paper. So just a bit of background about Life Story Group. We're made up of 3 brands: Anthology, which is an open market brands, and Pegasus and Renaissance, which are our later living brands, both in terms of independent living and also extra care provision. We have over 2,500 homes, down from Cornwall at the lowest point in the country up to Newcastle as well. And the example you've got on the screen is actually in Wilmslow, and it's a former site of a local authority building that they no longer had a requirement for, which has obviously brought forward a good number of extra care homes within the local community for local people to meet their needs as they age. One of the things that's particularly important is the opportunity for choice, and we've obviously got a variety of homes, both for sale, for rent, and also for rent to buy, that people are obviously able to look at as their needs change. So just really to reflect on the state of the market, and it somewhat made me laugh, as Lou reflected on, in the world post-COVID, because having managed to dodge it for 3 years, I kind of fell victim to it last week, but thankfully on the road to recovery. But I think one of the things that was particularly interesting was some of the areas that Ruth reflected on in terms of the challenges that she and other RPs are experiencing are very similar to the ones that we're experiencing in the private sector. So it is things like rising build costs, labour shortages, both in terms of around construction and then in terms of care staff. But it also, as well, is about, I think, the changing and evolving needs of potential renters or purchasers. So I think one of the things that we've very much seen is the importance of green space, the importance of being close to friends or building new friendships as a result. I think certainly in the few months when the world started to unlock, we were very much finding, for people who had perhaps lived on their own, who during COVID were very much more isolated, that issue around loneliness and social isolation was very much a motivator and driver for people to look at moving, who perhaps hadn't considered it before, were perhaps in the younger end of the older population. I think one of the really fascinating areas at the moment relates to supply and demand, and Lou's report reflects on this, as have a number of others published over recent years and months, the difference between the supply and the demand. So we know that there is a real issue in terms of the supply and the provision. So there are about 5,000 to 7,000 homes being built every year, specifically for older people, both in the social and the private space. And we know that the demand for it is within the region of 30 to 50,000. So for every year that we aren't collectively building to meet that demand, the pressures get greater and the challenges are more. And it's really interesting to reflect back on a statistic that I gave a couple of years ago at a HousingLIN event, which was around the supply of provision. As the older population rises, the supply per head of specialist housing has been falling from 139 homes per thousand aged 75 plus in 2015. That's now dropped to 110 homes per thousand over the last couple of years. And that just is only going to get worse. And obviously we know the demographic pressures are getting greater. One of the things that we've definitely seen more of in the private sector is the emergence of the rental market and people making the choice to rent as a proactive choice rather than perhaps if we look at first-time buyers, people who are renting as a result of financial affordability. And this is the photograph on the scheme is of a scheme that we have in Bristol, right in the heart of the city, where actually we've seen over the last year more people move in renting than looking to buy. And the reason for that is the choice and flexibility that brings to them in terms of both perhaps keeping their family home for family members. I know there was conversation in the chat about the family home having been that hub, so it continues to be the hub for the family, but also as well as a personal choice. It's been really interesting reflecting on the factors motivating the move that Lou spoke about in her opening to her presentation, in terms of the location, the feeling of safety and security, the importance for good transport links, and all of those reflect in the people that are coming through our doors to express an interest either into moving into one of our communities, either buying, renting or rent to buy. So reflecting on the Shakespeare Martineau white paper, it sits so much in the title, could later living be the answer to the housing crisis? Well, I was at an event the week before last, probably where I got sick from, and someone reflected upon, can it really be a crisis if it's been going on in various guises for 40 years or more? And I think that in itself made me stop and reflect that actually the challenges that we all experience have in many cases been occurring in a variety of different guises for a long period of time. And what's so great about the work of the LIN and others is that we are raising those challenges. We are pushing them back to local authorities, to government, to ourselves as well, I think, which is really important to see what we can do to help play a part of it. And the simple answer to the question that Shakespeare Martineau and Lou posed is absolutely, later living can be a massive part of the process and help solve the problem. And I think a big part of that comes down to the opportunity for choice. And I think it was interesting reflecting on some of the questions and comments in the chat room about, my parents maybe might not be looking at this stage because we use our family home for events, or they're not quite at that point, or they use the space because they haven't retired. And that's absolutely fine. And I think what we're trying to show is that there is options available for people, either as future proofing, or if they've hit a point of crisis, or if they simply want to perhaps create a broader community of friends as a result of perhaps sadly a bereavement or something like that. I think there's absolutely a huge place that the housing for older people can play. I think also it's interesting to reflect on some of the findings of Lou's work and research of others like Homes for Later Living around the difference that it makes to people when they do make that move in terms of the quality of life that they're living, the likely reduction in slips, trips and falls, which obviously both has a pressure for social care in the NHS, but more importantly, means that an older person is living their perhaps later years longer in better health as much as possible. And I think that's particularly important to reflect on. excuse me, building more later living homes of all types across all tenures in both the social and private sector. So this was another of the recommendations that came through from the report. I think it's always interesting reflecting on this, because I think as the numbers that I talked about right at the very beginning show, it doesn't matter whether you're someone in need of housing from the social sector, from the private sector. Ultimately, not enough of everything that is required is being built, and therefore we all have the onus to be able to assist and play our parts. I know that there are a number of you on from today from local authorities, both in terms of a commissioning role and also in determining planning applications as well. And I think we all have a very important role to play as far as that side of things is concerned. Ruth reflect on the time frame that it's taking to get through planning. And I know for the private sector, both our own personal experience and experience of others, is where there's a massive shortage of planners or senior planners have been retiring. It's taking longer and longer and longer to get through the process, all while at the same time the pressures in the local area are increasing. And that's definitely something that we can all collectively play our part in. Challenging planning priorities at a local and national level. I think quite often when you hear people talking about new developments or new communities being built, you hear about people importing older people to a particular area, or a pressure on GP provision or on the local NHS or local dentists and so on. It's often the case that that's done at a planning committee when you look around the room and you think actually the vast majority of people would be eligible, if nothing else, on the age criteria to move into one of the communities that you're looking at building. But there should be an understanding that actually the people in the vast majority of situations that we're looking at, working with, helping, supporting, already live in the local communities. They're just the people that perhaps haven't accessed your service because they don't know how to, or they potentially are a social care crisis waiting to happen, and it's just fortunate that that hasn't occurred as of yet. And I think many of you will be aware of the current consultation on the National Planning Policy Framework, which finishes at the end of this week, where specifically reference has been made to the retirement sector. And hopefully through that, there will be numbers and targets and sites identified, as Peter referred to in his presentation, specifically for older people. And I think as a good starter, a request that's been made both by HousingLIN and other members on the call, for 10% of new housing to be specifically targeted for older people is a good place to start. And I think it's also very important, and I put the picture of Michael Gove up here as I suppose the constant whilst we've had a number of changes in Housing Minister, that the older people's task force that has been much heralded and much discussed but not kind of moved too far forward, comes forward as a matter of priority. It was discussed a couple of years ago, discussed about it being launched imminently about 12 months ago, and we're still waiting. And I think that's going to be really, really crucial to put the importance of the need for housing for older people higher up the agenda within government. I think health and housing are so absolutely intertwined. So hopefully a strong message can go out from here again today about the importance of that. I think also as well, it's really important, and Lou reflected on it in the document, that we champion the benefits and the parts that we can all play. And a great example of this is by sharing best practice. So thank you very much, Robert Elvin from Norfolk County Council. I haven't ever met you before, but it was wonderful to read in the chat about the scheme and the work you're doing in Norfolk and the funding that you've got there. I think there are so many things that we saw from Lou's initial summary that people aren't aware of, or their view of it is something very different to what we know housing for older people to be all about. So if we can all go from today and perhaps have a conversation with someone who doesn't know anything about what we do at work, or the communities that we build, or the friendships that people foster, then we can all play our own parts as far as that side of things is concerned. We know the huge difference that it makes for someone who's taken the choice to move into one of our communities in terms of the quality of life, the difference from a social and interactive perspective, the physical and mental well-being differences that can be made, the investment that comes forward to the high street, the fact that we're invariably regenerating brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. So I think there is a part that we can all play, but it's wonderful that the HousingLIN and Lou and Shakespeare Martineau have given us the opportunity to have such a discussion today. So thank you very much for your time, and back over to you, Lou.
Thanks, Emma. I call it the power of the papers. There will be things in this white paper that people won't necessarily agree with. There will be things that from a personal perspective, you think, no, that's not for me. As a lawyer that's worked in retirement living for nearly 30 years, am I the sort of person that you want as a resident? Ruth will shake her head, because I would tear the service charge apart. I would tear the lease apart. So you don't want me there. So I said it at the very beginning, and I'll repeat it again. There is no one size fits all solution to this problem. But reflecting on exactly what Emma said, if it means that we actually have the discussion and broaden out that discussion to try and get people understanding more and more about what choices there are out there, we might lead the discussion into creating more aspirational living and improving the demand for it. So every little helps, as Tesco says. There are other supermarket brands available. Tony, moving on to you. You're on mute, Tony.
Hey, sorry, start again. Jeremy suggested I should speak last to give the older person's perspective on this issue, and hopefully wasn't just bowing to my advanced years, but also because for the last decade or so I've been spending my voluntary time representing older people into government, in the media and so on, and also I've been working professionally about later life issues for some 35 years and about property for 25. And I'd like to start by saying that a lot has changed for the better in that time. Sadly, that would be untrue, because although we probably understand better now than we've ever done the importance of providing housing in which people can retain their independence for longer, as we've been said before, we are still only building a fraction of the suitable homes needed. And while we recognise that the vast majority of people live and will continue to live in mainstream housing, we don't yet enforce planning conditions that would ensure that every new home built will be suitable for somebody to continue occupying when the mobility is reduced. And as was made earlier on in the discussion, the point was made that the consequent chronic lack of the right products in the right locations means that significant opportunities to improve the health and well-being of older people and reduce public expenditure are being missed. In fact, I'd suggest we've gone backwards, because the population is aging faster than any increase in suitable supply. So when older people are exhorted to free up homes for younger people, I allow myself a hollow laugh. And first slide, please. So some stats to conjure with here. So 3 million older people would like to downsize. Yeah, as we've heard before, only about 7,000 new retirement properties are being built each year. And 70% of over 65s would consider moving to a bungalow. But in 2020, less than 2,000 came out of the ground. The 1987 figure was 26,000. Like I said, we're going backwards. And yes, we all know the benefits, but older people can't be asked to move to housing that isn't there. And moreover, 2 million homes currently occupied by older people are deemed not decent, usually because the owners can't afford to adapt or improve them, asset rich, cash poor. Enabling more older singles and couples to move into housing that was in good repair, safe, warm, accessible, would also be very welcome. And further, as that point was made earlier on, if some of these units were on our declining high streets, they could help revitalise our town and city centres and allow the occupants to live close to the shops and services they need in their daily lives. So next slide. Yes, so growth is in the pipeline, and Lang and Breeson expect the number of seniors housing units in the UK to grow by 9% over the next 5 years. But as they importantly go on to say, the rate of delivery will still be dwarfed by the UK's ageing population, deepening the existing imbalance between supply and demand. So what's going wrong exactly? Another quote from Lang and Breeson report perhaps explains that. The benefits are substantial, yet just 20% of local authorities in England have supportive planning policies or sites allocated to seniors housing. So we start with a lack of strategic support at planning level. But I would argue developers themselves are not always winning the hearts and minds of those who make or influence these decisions. Every weekday I publish a daily digest of later life news, and I regularly carry stories on retirement developments and how they're getting on. And I think we can learn a lot from why applications for new ones are being refused on a regular basis. And here are just a few recent quotes. The planning committee concluded the development does not meet the needs of the ageing population. There's not enough standard housing, whilst there's a proliferation of retirement buildings. There is already a lack of GP facilities locally. Add more residents who will likely need a higher than average medical support, and it is untenable. The locations are not appropriate for elderly, having to navigate steep hills. The property market is saturated with retirement homes. Some have been on sale for a number of years, even when sellers are prepared to lose a considerable amount of money. This is prime building land for first-time buyer properties. The scheme does not include affordable housing. And relaunch of retirement flats bid could dash hopes of affordable housing alternative. So there's a regular resistance being met at planning from councillors and local residents who insist that starter or affordable homes should take priority, or who fear having more older people to care for in their community, ignoring the fact that these older people are currently living locally in unsuitable, possibly unsafe homes, and their care bills might well end up being paid for by that same local authority. And critics do regularly point to existing schemes not being fully occupied. With respect, it's a valid argument, but this can be down to a series of factors, not least location. As tempting as the retirement apartments might be, many prospective older home buyers will resist moving away from their immediate neighbourhood with its ready-made friendship and support network. And yes, apartment blocks, retirement villages, they can provide a significant part of the answer, but not all of it. The fact that these places don't always fill up demonstrates that. Well, what needs to happen? 4 things. 1, make every new home built suitable for older people to move into or age in place. 2, do more to make the argument about the benefits to society and rebuff the myths. And we do need to move away from the socially divisive argument of starter and affordable homes versus later life ones. It shouldn't be either or. 3, developers and housing associations, I suggest, need to think out of the box more. Not everyone wants what's being built at the moment. And finally, engage more with older people themselves to find out what is really needed locally and what the impacts and benefits will be before putting in an application. So I'll go back to number 1 now. And I start there. By 2066, a further 8.6 million UK residents will be aged 65 and over. That's the size of London. And the fastest increase, those aged 85 and over. Where are they all going to live? Next slide. A 2020 BRE report found that we had the oldest housing stock in Europe, and to replace it at current rates, each new build would need to last 1,000 years. That means taking action now to ensure that every mainstream home built is one where people can age in place. And what's more, we might be living longer, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that our healthy lifespan isn't keeping up. Around 40% of those aged 60 to 74 have a lifetime limiting illness. It goes up to 60% at 75 and over. And as we mentioned before, DCLG itself estimates a supply gap of up to 45,000 units a year of housing suitable for older people with various support needs. And it's a figure that's growing as each year passes. And here's the thing, a baby born today has over a 50% chance of reaching the age of 90. By the time today's younger generations reach retirement age or start to live with a disability, there will be even fewer suitable homes available than now. Now, Habintech did some handy research recently of 324 local housing plans and found that there will be just 1 new accessible home erected in the next 10 years for every 77 people in the population. And that's actually down from 1 every 67 2 years ago. Like I said, we're going backwards. So this pressure on local authorities and health services is to keep people in their own homes for as long as possible rather than enter the care system. But if those individuals can't be supported to live safely in their own homes, they will have to go into care, and a large number will not be able to pay for themselves. We mentioned briefly the government's consultation going on. And I'm sure many people listening will know that given the opportunity to make lifetime standards a prerequisite for all new housing, government opted last time around to leave it to individual authorities to decide whether the developers need to make a small additional investment. There are bright spots. The London plan requires local authorities to ensure that 90% of homes meet Category 2 standard for accessibility, and that's broadly equivalent to the old lifetime home standard. But outside of London, less than a quarter of new homes are required to meet the standard. I'd also like to point out that London is showing the way on wheelchair accessibility, where they require 10% of new housing to meet that higher standard. As I said, the government is currently consulting. They're making some positive noises. We can but hope, but we all know what happens to consultations. Not helped by having 6 housing ministers in the last 12 months. And I'm sure many of you will know that Category 2 requires a home to be accessible to most people and fit for purpose for older people, those with reduced mobility and some wheelchair users, not just older people, you notice. And the estimated additional cost, extra £1,400 per home. However, I contend that not making them readily accessible will incur a cost we will all pay, this and future generations. Now, I view social care, health and housing, has been mentioned by other speakers, as 3 legs of a stool, each of which needs to be in place for the stool to remain upright. I also would say we have a duty to look at the impact of inappropriate or poor housing on health in a far more integrated, holistic way. As mentioned earlier, we need to break down the silos between the various departments and organisations with a stake in this and get everyone to understand the arguments. Agreed, starter and affordable homes are needed too. But every time an older person moves into a purpose-built unit, it frees up a home for a couple or family to occupy. It's a virtuous circle. And that argument needs to be understood at a planning level and by the public at large. The next stat, the Strategic Society estimate that savings to the state for each new specialist retirement housing unit is £83,000 over 10 years. That takes into account reduced health and care needs, reduction in local authority entitlements, and first-time buyers not having to rent and so receive housing benefits. So invest in older people's housing and the whole of society benefits, but that opportunity is currently being ignored. And as ever, I suggest it's a matter of priorities and votes. Between 2013 and May 2022, the government provided over 22 billion in equity loans for 355,000 starter homes. And that created a lot of nice headlines for about £60,000 per home. But the UK needs later homes too. And here's the point. Some 95% of older people live in accommodation and lacking even basic accessibility features. So when mobility or health issues strike, they can be left living in just 1 or 2 rooms, as we so frequently see. Now, a percentage will inevitably suffer a fall as a direct result of living in a house not fitted with basic mobility equipment, such as grab rails and ramps. Falls and fractures in people aged 65 and over account for over 4 million hospital bed days each year in England alone. Moreover, as again been pointed out, they can remain stuck in those beds if their discharge assessment finds their home is unsafe to return to. Now, surely it's time to make all of this a national discussion, a top priority benefiting all generations in the process. And ideally, we'd engage the political parties to make this a manifesto pledge for the next election. So next, choice. Now, lovely as they can be, and not everyone wants to live in a village or apartment block with only older people living in it. Louise's stats bore that out. Most would like, if possible, to remain close to their existing support and friendship networks, and that's not possible if the only housing available is some distance away. And many older people also want to access facilities, leisure, shopping, medical, without depending upon a car, and that's not possible if the only retirement housing available is remote from a town centre, built on a hill, or has no reliable public transport. Not everyone wants to live in a shoebox, which is often all that's on offer. They might want their family to stay or have one room dedicated to hobbies. Many couples want separate bedrooms, so more choice is needed. One brilliant option for the future I'd like to mention is intergenerational housing. In Bristol, volunteers from the Anchor Society charity in the University of West of England have spent the last 18 months developing the idea of the UK's first intergenerational housing community based on pioneering projects in Holland and Spain that many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. Bristol is an incredibly expensive place to live for students, so the scheme will see a development where one student unit is built for every 4 older people's units, and the students will provide companionship and general support for so many hours a week in return for subsidised accommodation. Another way to mix the generations is by integrating smaller numbers of dedicated houses or apartments into new developments and on a range of tenures, including shared ownership, in effect pepper potting. And several years ago, and I and several others worked out what we believe would work on a much more general level. We call them smart hamlets, and these are small scale developments, 10, 20, 30 units, which will incorporate a number of older people's apartments or houses available again on a mix of tenures. And residents will agree beforehand to offer mutual support, just as villages and neighbourhoods did before we started sectioning off who lives where. So, more choice. Oranges are not the only fruit. We need more age-friendly communities and to enable more intergenerational support. And last but definitely not least, consultation. If developers want to create housing that will not only get through planning but also sell or let, they need to do more homework. And I've got an example here. It's another quote from a recent planning. So later living specialist Rangeford Villages has received resolution of grant planning from South Cambridgeshire, made possible by genuine collaborative working with the local community and key stakeholders. Following on from over a year of design development and extensive discussion with the planning authority, we are pleased to see our proposals unanimously approved. So a big new retirement village going through on the nod is ample demonstration of what needs to happen early on, ideally at the pre-app stage. Consult older people before you draw up plans. Find out what might entice them in terms of size, design, tenures, facilities, and so on. I promise you, we just love to give our opinions. Run panels, focus groups, pliers with coffee and custard creams, perhaps give us some shopping vouchers at the end, and we'll be there. The body I represent, the English Aging Network, have run lots of what we call mature conversations, older people's focus groups talking about these sort of issues, and we'd be happy to help. So, to conclude, win over the public, the benefits, provide more choice, listen to what older people want, and you might encourage more to make what for many will be their last move. And while you're about it, please, please make sure that every home you build from now on will allow people to age in place. One day your children and your grandchildren will thank you for it. And here are my contact details at the end. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to connect. And please do join the collaborative network that I help to run, which is the Age Action Alliance. It's free. And that's me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tony. My goodness, we've got through a lot. It's 11:20. We've got 10 minutes for questions. We've got about 32 questions sitting in the chat box, although some of them are more kind of statements than questions. The first, we're not going to be able to get through all of them, so I'm so sorry about that. But the first one I wanted to go to was actually from Rose Gilroy, who has put loads in the chat, but it's one that's really close to my heart. And it's she makes the comment here that another impediment to retirement housing for sale is that values seem to fall. If equity is important, this is not an attractive option. Ruth, can I come to you first on that? Because for me, that it's all about the kind of the idea. It's about getting across to the public, educating people in a very collaborative way, the benefits that come from this type of accommodation, as opposed to just seeing it as a capital asset.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And actually, a lot of homeowners, firstly, are worried about the capital that they're putting into that and whether their family will then get it back. I suppose there are other benefits, as in if your capital's in this and not somewhere else where you're having to spend that capital then on your care costs. Actually, it's safer in there anyway, even if the accommodation itself doesn't appreciate over the years. I think also that, we have a lot of customers that find it more economical. They don't have a roof to replace, they don't have a heating system to replace, they don't have windows and doors to replace over the years. Quite often their bills are more economical, the buildings are more economical to run, etc. So I think there are savings on your day-to-day expenses, even if your capital doesn't appreciate over time. Is that the kind of sort of thing that you're asking me around?
Yes, absolutely. I'll probably open it up to the wider panel though, because it's about how do we actually get that message out to people? How do we get people to understand that actually aging in place in that sort of accommodation is a good thing, even if your capital asset doesn't go up in value? And I can see Peter waving at me, so we'll go to you, Peter.
Yes, I mean, very much. I echo Ruth's point about not having maintenance costs, not having to do things like thermal insulation upgrades, which are hugely expensive at the same time as you're facing fuel poverty. And if we actually look at some of the alternatives to staying in place, like the massive erosion of capital, if you go for something like an equity release product, and the family, if you like, end up with even less than a declining asset in not all, but only in some retirement properties, then I think the equation is really very different. And I think Rose Gilroy, who I know well, her point is well made, but often that is in private provision, not in social housing provision. Most of the social housing provision, things like shared ownership, actually maintain the value of people's equity. And of course, if you rent either through social rent or market rent, then you can actually plan properly in terms of what your outgoings are. And looking at the average costs, they are actually quite affordable, especially if you factor in the level of care provision that you would otherwise have to pay for most of the time from your own pocket. So I think people need to do, as well as the state needing to do, a total costing approach. I think, families need to do a total costing approach in terms of what mum, dad, auntie, uncle, whatever, actually gets out of the move to a right size, right type home.
Anybody else want to comment? Don't need Ruth.
Yeah, absolutely. Other comments always spark other thoughts, don't they? I think also, that we've, as RPs, we've had a tough road this past year or two with the Housing Ombudsman and naming and shaming and all that sort of thing, and especially, things like cladding on leaseholder buildings and who pays for it and what have you. And I think there is a little bit of public nervousness for a homeowner leasehold at the moment, and I think we have a collective accountability and responsibility really to put something out. I suppose, Lou, you were saying, what can we do? I think probably collectively, there is something that we can do about the benefits and about busting a lot of myths that are out there. And I think those myths are there for the private market just as much as the RP market, and we probably don't come together enough as private providers and RPs actually for one bigger voice. And I think people still don't, in the general public, apart from the providers that provide it, really still don't understand the product and the overall product, not just the homeowner bit of it.
Thank you. Jeremy, you took yourself off mute. Do you want to?
Yeah, no, well spotted. I think, this is an area that I think we addressed in a previous white paper with you as well, which demonstrated actually as operators, sometimes the way we market isn't actually according to what people actually want either. So we need to think both in terms of the supply and the growth of the sector, but also how we market and position this in terms of making sure that offer is appropriate. But just coming back to the question that Rose raised and others have commented on, I think there's a balance here to really be struck between creating a really good leasehold model. And many people haven't been in the leasehold sector for many years. They are either outright owners, their mortgages, they haven't got their mortgages anymore. So they're used to a freehold model. There are also mutuals and other freehold style developments like Pegasus and Renaissance that offer elements of cooperation around some of this, which picks up Tony's point. But also we need to make sure there's some consumer protection around this as well. And when Ruth talks about the Ombudsman, we also need to think, how can we look at the type of consumer protection to guarantee some greater reassurance to people making that decision to move. And again, Emma may have some more experience around that as well.
I mean, I think one of the great things that the discussion today has highlighted is about the importance of messaging, of language, of explaining and communicating both more broadly to people through the planning process, as Tony reflected on, but also as well to potential customers, tenants, renters, purchasers. And I think it just really reflects on the importance of explaining what moving into retirement housing is all about, the value you get from it, the additional benefits to it from there, but also as well providing that opportunity through choice, so that if someone does take the decision that they don't want to purchase as a result of a potential concern that they have, there are renting options available to them as well. So there is that opportunity for flexibility, and I think that's something that the sector should be commended upon.
Thank you. Conscious that we've only got a few minutes left, I just wanted to pick up, because I think this would be a good one to cover. From Derek Rowell, he said, to help develop awareness and build confidence in transitioning to last time homes, what role does the age-friendly community have to play in that? Who'd like to go on that one first? Because I think there is a lot that can be done in that space.
Yeah. Okay. Can I start, Lou?
Yeah, of course.
Very, very briefly. One of the things that we've not talked about, I made oblique reference to it in very, very briefly in my presentation, was the role of things like neighbourhood plans. One of the things that I factored and my colleagues factored into our draft neighbourhood plan is to make the place an age-friendly community, which is actually totally coincident with the objectives of things like local councils, climate emergencies, where we're encouraging people to shop and recreate locally, use public transport, blah, 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 blah. So, you know, in our draft neighbourhood plan, everything's on a bus route. Every single new development would be on a bus route. And we actually end up, funnily enough, with providing more potential housing spaces than the local plan. But that's not, but the age-friendly thing is really important in terms of making sure that you actually do factor in those elements that people do want, like access to shops, access to welfare facilities. But myth busting is important. It's sort of Tony's point. GPs love extra care because they can actually do everything in one place very quickly. So do people who are peripatetic district nursing staff, podiatrists, physiotherapists. So age-friendly community is about bringing all the elements that you want into one place and actually articulating that through provision. And I think it is really doable, and I'm sure Tony will echo that, but it does just need, you know, it needs you to switch your brain on and just reflect the reality of what people want, and to do it effectively by some joined up thinking. Go and have a look at the In One Place work in South Wales. I think that's quite revelatory.
Thanks, Peter. Tony?
I was just at one point, I've got very involved in the age-friendly movement a few years ago now. We actually got the first, I think it was the first town in the UK to join, which was a Wiltshire town. And what was happening was that everything was being looked at through the lens of the person, you know, whose mobility was being restricted. And so everything sort of came under that one aegis. So you looked at that, as was mentioned, you looked at everything from the housing to the transport to the buses to everything had to be looked at. And that way, people's perspective changed entirely. And I think if you're going to have one attempt to get a society sorted out is to look at everything through that one lens, and so much will actually follow through that.
Yeah, really good point.
And I think actually, if you reflect on your report, some of the great things from your reports are the individual case studies, the commentary from people whose lived experience is one of the retirement communities that you questioned and spoke to them in. I think, you know, that is really, really powerful, because you're hearing it directly from people who are experiencing it, who made the choice and are really loving what they've chosen.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we wanted to do that, really, because, you know, so frequently we talk to providers, we talk to the operators, but actually it's so important to talk to the people that have actually made the step and made the move. And why did they do that? That's what we wanted to try and find out. You know, what was it that appealed to them? Because if we can pick on those aspects and actually reverse the focus, you know, what more can we do with that? So, okay, it's 11:32. I need to bring the session to an end. I'm sure we could all sit here and talk about this for many, many hours. We've got 36 Q&As, brilliant, fantastic attendance, and thank you everybody for your time. Thank you particularly for the panelists for their expert knowledge and contribution to the Q&A at the end. I don't know if Jeremy wishes to say any more, but
yeah, if I could just say,
I've had fun for a Monday morning.
Yeah, no, it's been really a great session, and Lou, thanks for chairing it so expertly. A couple of things just to pick up. Another question is the white paper out yet? No, this today was a soft launch, and we will be sharing it through in partnership with Lou and the team to make sure that everybody gets it when it's out formally. So do watch this space.
So, Jeremy, just on that, if anybody wishes to have a copy now before we actually formally launch it next month, then just email me at my work address and
Okay.
can have a copy sent to them.
Yeah, and do if you haven't got Louise's work address, just contact our info box and we can forward that on. So, but just on behalf of the HousingLIN team, again, thanks to Lou, to our sponsor, Shakespeare, Martineau, all the speakers, where Peter, Ruth, Emma, Tony, fantastic contributions, really thoughtful, thought-provoking as well debate. And in fact, if you found this of interest, this afternoon we have another session looking at a bit more detail around something that Peter picked up, I think, in particular around, how do we create connected communities, and what is the role of our housing in those communities? In fact, I think all of you touched on that in some way. So do to join us again this afternoon if you haven't already signed up. And just as we said right at the outset, the copies of the PowerPoint presentations are recording, as well as the chat and the Q&A sessions from this session will be distributed to everybody who signed up for the session in the coming days. But that just leaves me to thank all of you again, and the team behind the scenes who've made this possible. Thanks, Jerome and Sally, and look forward to joining you at the next session if you're with us. Okay, bye for now. Have a good lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.